What were the creepiest declassified documents of the last decade? Story 1, it recently came out in released Cabinet Office documents in the UK that in 1984, a French security officer placed two real bombs in the grounds of the French embassy in London in advance of a visit by President Mitterrand in order to test British security. He just casually carried them past British border checks by telling them he was an intelligence officer. Sound familiar? That's because it became a story on the sitcom Yes, Prime Minister. And let's not forget that 1 year later, French intelligence service members bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in the port of Auckland, NZ, murdering one crew member. This was a terrorist act against both Greenpeace and the government of New Zealand, who were opposed to the French blowing up South Pacific Islands with nuclear weapons. France seemed to think bombs were a great way to silence its critics. In the 1980 story, 2. A 2015 declassified Russian document verified the existence of a drone called the Poseidon drone. This is no ordinary drone. It is an underwater drone containing the largest nuclear weapon ever created, having a yield of 200 megatons, 4 times larger than the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear bomb ever created. Furthermore, it contains a cobalt-style bomb, which when detonated unleashes a 200 nuclear tidal wave, which can destroy any coastal city in its path. Just for context, the 2004 Indonesian tsunami had waves as tall as 20 meters. This is 10 times larger and full of dangerous radioactive material. Obviously, this is a last-ditch effort, but it makes me think, if this is declassified, what horrors still remain classified? Story 3. Did you know it's impossible to predict some things? For example, how dust will disperse. Even if you knew how much dust, when, wind speed, humidity, pressure, etc., you wouldn't know how it disperses, even with today's supercomputer. Too many variables. So, if you are in the military and want to know how biological or chemical agents would disperse if dropped from a plane, there's really only one thing you can do. You drop tons of zinc cadmium sulfide on unsuspecting people, or disease, or bugs. Story 4. Basically every broken arrow incident, especially the ones that occurred during the Soviet collapse. The idea that the military can just lose track of a nuclear bomb, a miniature sun basically, is already terrifying, even if most of the devices are recovered. However, Russia lost track of about 200 nuclear bombs after the collapse of the USSR, and they still have no idea where they are. I understand that the Soviet Union fell apart in the 90s, but since so many of their nuclear bombs are still unaccounted for, I consider it an ongoing crisis. Story 5. A document from the Brazilian Air Force confirming an operation called Operation Plate, confirming the story of a retired Air Force colonel, where he describes him as the commander of a group of soldiers in the Amazon jungle, following the appearance of strange lights followed by panic of the local residents. In the story, as he describes, he and his group follow the lights for days, until one day one of the lights decides to do a special show in front of his group by standing still over a river, floating in midair. No noise, no nothing. At one point, the light turns off and they can see a huge football ball-shaped thing, huge, floating a couple of feet over the water, and a little door opens at the top. He relates he was there to photograph, film, record the sound of every encounter, and he does exactly that. A couple of weeks after giving this interview, he is found dead, like Epstein, by self-destruction. Years later, the Air Force discloses the documents confirming the operation and discloses some of the photographs, but they do that by spreading the documents in the National Archive without any classification to make it difficult to find. Some people have found some of the pictures, and I think this is the first official proof of that kind. Story 6. Project Starfish Prime. In 1962, the USA, in the middle of the Cold War, wanted to know what would happen if you made an atomic bomb explode in the magnetosphere. Knowing scientists at the time had zero idea on the size of effects, the government decided to test the experiment without any models and directly on terrain. Thus, Project Starfish Prime happened where the government literally blew a bomb in the magnetosphere in a jeopardized to know if we'd die or not. Our magnetosphere took 30 years to recover from it. That teaches about how dumb and inconsiderate science can also be. Story 7. I don't know if it's truly creepy, but we are just now getting more about how much influence the military has had in Hollywood. People knew about the Pentagon film liaison, but didn't, and still don't, realize the scope of what's going on. Most people know the government provides support to the film industry. Top Gun was essentially a Navy recruitment video. However, how often and how much the government influences Hollywood has come out. In order to receive any kind of aid, like military equipment, in movies or TV shows, The Pentagon reviews and provides strong suggestions for changes in the script. It was previously thought the number of movies and TV shows that had undergone this process was around 500. Through FOI requests in the last 5 to 10 years, we've learned it's been more like 1,800 productions. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, Google Phil Strub. He worked as an entertainment liaison for the Pentagon for a while. Story 8. I am kind of late to the party, so this will probably get buried, but is worth sharing nonetheless. A few months back, I came across a very detailed report about a CIA operation named Operation Pegasus. Long story short, the CIA worked with Escobar and imported great quantities of cocaine into the USA for numerous reasons, two of which are profit for it and destabilizing African American communities. The military were in on it, and the guy who blew the whistle on the whole thing was one of the Air Force pilots who made the deliveries. He describes in detail the entire operation, links many people to the operation, many of whom are very recognizable names even now. And overall, it is one deep, deep rabbit hole. The documents should not be that hard to find online. Story 9. Edward Snowden announces to the whole world that, no, they are lying through their crap-eating grin. The United States of America is spying on its own citizens and the citizens and governments of the world. Do not listen to their bold-faced lies. Look at their president cowering in a corner, desperately trying to spin the fact that PRISM is indeed hoovering up Americans, French, German, English, Chinese, Russian data without consent or even a warrant. And they are still abusing the process, most recently with the FISA court, which gave a rare rebuke and chastised long-term government officials for lying to a judge. Story 10. MKUltra. Oh, wait. Most of those files were so bad that they were destroyed entirely by Richard Helms, except for a very small amount which was misplaced and discovered years later. From that, we discovered MKUltra involved drugging citizens, establishing secret detention centers across the world, where people were experimented on, stealing men from brothels and drugging and experimenting on them, abuse, drug dealing, and the involvement of dozens of willing hotels and businesses at the government's behest. And all this is just what was admitted to by the FBI and CIA in the 70s, from a small fraction of the overall papers that were destroyed. To this day, some people think that Epstein was a handler for MKUltra, which is ultimately where he made his money, got his protection from government prosecution, and the reason he was killed. And it's kind of hard to discredit that, since the width and breadth of the project was so large and because most of the information pertaining to it was destroyed. Story 11. Maybe this isn't as creepy as simply evil, but Operation Condor was a mass murder by the CIA where they installed dictatorships and committed widespread state terrorism across South America. Literally every South American country except the Guyanas and Trinidad or Tobago was involved. South American governments then collaborated with the U.S. to kill 50,000, disappear 30,000, and imprison 400,000. Every country south of the equator, except Peru and Ecuador, was heavily involved. The U.S. is still declassifying documents. That's not to mention the times that the U.S. did similar things in Central America. Under Reagan, the CIA financed a war in Nicaragua. The money for that war came from the CIA creating a cocaine epidemic in black communities. At the same time, the government was, and still is, putting so many people into prison. 22% of the world's prison population is in America, and many of these prisons are private and force the prisoners into slavery. Slavery for 2.2 million Americans because they accepted drugs that were promoted by the CIA in the first place. Story 12. I'm late, but I'm surprised I don't see this among the top comments. Just a few weeks after Eisenhower's farewell address warns us of the danger of the military-industrial complex, and just 4 days after JFK is inaugurated, a B-52 Stratofortress broke up in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, dropping a payload of 3 to 4 megaton nuclear bombs with a yield 250 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Though it's somewhat disputed, the document claims that just a single low-voltage switch prevented one of the bombs from detonating. Based on wind patterns at the time, the radioactivity would have very likely carried over the eastern seaboard from Goldsboro to Richmond to Philadelphia. We were a low-voltage switch away from permanently altering eastern NC and killing thousands of Americans. Worse, given the racism of the day, we likely wouldn't even have helped millions of black Americans in affected cities. Take Hurricane Katrina, multiple it by 1,000, and move it back to the 1960s. These nuclear accidents are called broken arrow events by the U.S. government, and they've publicly admitted to 32. They also include another one in Mars Bluff, which involved an actual explosion. Story 13, not really creepy, but very, very weird, was Project Gay Bomb. The US government wanted non-lethal chemical weapon in the 1990s, and the concept of a gay bomb came to them. The military scientists said that they could make a chemical that, when inhaled, can affect the part of the brain that controls affection and self-control. What this general wanted was a bomb that basically made everyone make out with each other, while military personnel would rappel in with gas masks on carrying out their mission. So, for example, hostage situations. But what I find funnest about this is how it was treated like a last resort weapon. Like they tried the best they could to reason with the men to get the hostages, but it just wasn't working. I don't think the project went public until recently. I think it was stopped because they found the idea to distasteful. This is the best I could explain it. The videos and articles can explain it way better. Story 14. There are currently unreleased documents related to the Plum Island Biowarfare Laboratory and Program, in which the US military experimented on disease vectors, including Lyme-carrying ticks. These docs have not yet been made public, even though they were supposed to be declassified in 2019. Instead, they were incorporated into a Department of Defense investigation, just as they were about to hit the 50-year declassification point from the program's close in 1969. Calling the classified docs into an investigation just before release gives the government sufficient justification to keep them classified for another 25 years. It'll likely be 2044 until the government reveals whether the previous 75 years of Lyme disease outbreak and spread in the US was an attempt by our military to develop bioweaponry capable of physically and mentally debilitating entire populations. Story 15. Documents show that the British government were operating informants in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Nothing shocking about that, but they were actively assisting in making sure that these informants didn't get caught. Even when they were involved in the murders of civilians, loyalist paramilitaries in the 90s, operating in the mid-Ulster region, made it their goal to attack and kill families that had a relation to known Republicans, regardless if those families were politically active or not. The leader of this group, called Billy Wright, or King Rat, was an informant and received information on targets. This was all part of a wider policy of forcing the IRA to the negotiating table. Still shocking to know how aware the government was of what these people were doing and happy to ignore it or, as it appears, assist in it. Story 16, Operation Northwoods and Operation Mongoose. This document was a set of proposals on Cuba. It was literally subtitled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It was basically an engineered plan to mess their U.S. own crap up and blame it on Cuba. Operation Northwoods called for faked and actual terrorist actions against the U.S. to be conducted by the U.S., but done in such a way that they could be blamed on Cuba. This would provide a pretext for launching a full-scale military invasion of the island nation and the removal of Fidel Castro. Here are excerpts from the ideas put forth in a March 13, 1962, proposal for U.S.-initiated actions which could be falsely blamed on Cuba. A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give a genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. A remember the Maine incident could be arranged in several forms. A. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida. Real or simulated? Story 17. Frantic pleas for information from the State Department to the families of missing citizens was the only option in an investigation of the death of John Lewis Gaddis, the son of late evangelist Martin Luther King Jr. The son was killed on September 21, 1990 in the border of Sierra Leone and Guinea while looking for help at an Ethiopian border post. Gaddis was a volunteer worker in the United Nations. One of the letters addressed to the family of the White House intern, Chandra Levy, who vanished in May 2001, offers a brief summation. The handwritten note answers a series of questions. Because my investigator asked me to, I'll provide a brief summary. It then runs through possible connections between the two cases. Your investigation is already satisfying our investigation, which began in 1994. I thank you again for your continuing engagement. You do our work. The footnote calls to ask the family for directions and resumes the chronology. Story 18. This isn't necessarily a declassified document, but it's something the government tries to keep secret. It's U.S. patent. The patent is titled Method of an Apparatus for Inducing Desired States of Consciousness. This was a patent published in 1994 that allows the government to use EEG waveform, which resemble radio waves, to induce altered states of consciousness. So the government has access and exclusive privilege to use radio or other means to control your state of consciousness. And it is available for literally everyone to see if you look at the patent. This is most definitely not the only patent of its kind owned by the government. And you can see the referenced patents for this one in particular on several websites. Story 19, I'm super late to this thread, but there's a CIA document that was released in 2008 that is a transcript of a psychic who was able to astral project. They were trying to test his ability and uncover him as a fraud by giving him coordinates on Mars 1 million years ago. He couldn't see what the coordinates were. He only knew that they were written on a card in an envelope in front of him. He started describing pyramids and dust storms, dying race of people. It's pretty creepy. Story 20. The interesting part was to save weight, they removed extra emergency parachutes for the cabin that would have saved them. The 3 crew members in the upper cabin were passed out but breathing, and the 4 in the lower deck of the cabin alive until impact, or vice versa, I can't remember for sure. The personal oxygen tanks were found and were partially used to prove this, among other things. The scary part is the guy that designed the O-rings for the booster rockets said they had never been tested below the temps at launch, and hours beforehand recommended they not launch. NASA had already delayed and wanted to launch before Russia's planned launch the following week. 100% preventable. Story 21. The one COINTELPRO document. If you are unfamiliar with it, it's the program carried out by the FBI and state governments to actively frame members of the Black Panther Party of crimes to help tear it apart. Imagine if the government started randomly doing that to other organizations, i.e., the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Prisoners of War, or National Rifle Association. People would be livid and rioting in the streets. However, the only thing that happened when this came to light was that several members of the Black Panthers were released from jail, while people on the far right, and unfortunately many others, continue to believe the lies spread about them by these government agencies. Story 22. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. And it showed how to dig a 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard. And if there is a nuclear threat, to get your family and go in there and cover it with a door. So obviously that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own grave. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. Story 23, Area 51, was never publicly acknowledged by the US government until around the 2010s, if I remember correctly. The reason was because many contractors who had worked there had inhaled fumes. Lead paint and other classified materials are disposed of in a trench on site and routinely burned, where the fumes could be inhaled, and were dying. All they wanted to know was what fumes they had inhaled so their doctors could save them. The answer they ultimately got was essentially, okay, yes, this place exists. We used to make reconnaissance aircraft there, but you're not allowed to know what it is that's killing you. None of the contractors survived, but because of their lawsuit, the government finally acknowledged Area 51. Story 24, the Times Beach incident. Very surprised no one has brought up this incident. The government had to hide the fact that 30 years ago, in a town that no longer exists, toxic waste was just poured all over the roads by an independent party who had no clue what he was doing. The government did tests and for a few years told nobody about how they were living on poisoned ground. It's appalling how they told no one. But what's worse is the only guy to suffer, at least for the parties at fault, was the guy who was given the toxic waste with no info as to what it was or what he should do with it. Story 25. Operation Nitro Zeus, OMZ. US's plan to completely shut down Iran's critical national infrastructure in the event that they went to war with Israel after Stuxnet, 2009 plus. Not declassified, but information the GOVT doesn't want out. Gibney, 2016, 0 days. I mean, you've just been focusing on Stuxnet, but that was just a small part of a much larger Iranian mission. Nitro Zeus, we spent hundreds of millions, maybe billions on it. In the event that Israelis did attack Iran, we assumed we would be drawn into the conflict. We built in attacks on Iran's command and control system, so the Iranians couldn't talk to each other in a fight. We infiltrated their IADS, Integrated Air Defense System, military air defense system, so they couldn't shoot down our planes if we flew over. We also went after their civilian support systems, power grids, transportation, communications, financial systems. We were inside waiting, watching, ready to disrupt, degrade, and destroy those systems with cyber attacks. And in comparison, Stuxnet was a back alley operation. NZ was the plan for a full-scale cyber war with no attribution. Story 26. It's not a declassified document, but a friend of mine that served in Desert Storm told me some things. Every morning during muster, their group was given a small pill to take supposedly to protect them from the toxins the Iranians were releasing into the air. My friend thought it was odd, and he never swallowed his pill, just as some other members of their group didn't. Years go by, and all of the people that he still talks to that took the pill have cancer of various types, as well as a plethora of other medical issues. The ones that did not take the pill seemingly have nothing wrong with them, other than normal effects of being middle aged. Some crazy stuff, and often the military enlisted become guinea pigs for the government without their knowledge or consent. Story 27. Not so much documents, but tech for military use. In the 90s, many military bases were outfitted with microwave communications dishes for long range communication between units and installations. The precursors to modern shielded versions used on some cell towers, mounted very high up and aimed away from people. They would mount these near ground level or on top of low sheds. Used to be a joke that if you got married while in the service and didn't want kids, go stand in front of the dish for about 5 minutes and you are guaranteed to shoot blanks. It was accurate. Sonic cannons, used for crowd control. Some Navy ships have them for use in pirate engagement and anti-protest use. They can cause anything from really horrible headaches up through full-on paralysis. Depends on the setting and the biology of the individual it is aimed at. Also, they look less like a cannon, no barrel or obvious aim, more like those leaf antennas for TV. Stealth helicopters were fun. Back in the early 90s, I lived near a training base that is now a cyber command site. They would test the helicopters out over rural neighborhoods for real-world testing. You had no way to know the helicopter was coming by except for a very low-frequency sound that you felt more than heard, and the fact that the air felt pressurized for a brief time. Super weird. They fixed the pressurized feeling after my mom called the base and asked if they were testing something in our area. Story 28. This probably would never go to the government, but I'm on here anonymously. I grew up in orphanages in the United States. It was one orphanage I was in that once a week there would be two men that would come in and basically examine the children, and we don't know why. But once they chose the child, they would take them, and we would never see that child again. Myself and another child went in the hallway of one of the bedrooms, and we heard some voices speaking with the male and female, and they were talking about how the night before they cut 7 children's heads off and that they were in a coma, toast state, as they were walking up to their death. Now, I didn't imagine this, and no, the other child didn't either that was listening again. I'm on here. And honestly, if you can believe it or not, I say government, because those orphanages were ran by Department Children Family Services.